This episode will peel back the mysterious veil behind various strange phenomena. Let's rewind to the moments before the space station accident. The commander was making final adjustments to the dual quantum entanglement experiment, and Joe was unaware that danger was looming. Suddenly, all communications were cut off, and the space station began to shake violently. Joe stumbled, and then she crashed directly into the window. When everything returned to calm, the commander followed the floating blood to find Joe embedded in the glass. Blood continued to gush from her head into the vacuum of space. He quickly stuffed tissues into the hole in the window, and then brought Joe's body down. Upon receiving the news of Joe's death, Magnus immediately took Alice to the command center. Along the way, the commander's daughter comforted Alice, assuring her that everything would pass. But in reality, all of this is happening in another parallel world, where Joe returns to Earth while the commander perishes. To console her, Alice even gives her beloved doll to Commander's daughter. The events in the two parallel worlds unfold completely differently. What's even more perplexing is that the surviving commander distinctly remembers the experimental equipment sitting on the table, but after the incident, the equipment suddenly disappears. However, he doesn't have time to dwell on it because there are only 3 seats in the escape pod. Both the commander and the Joe from the other parallel world make the same decision, to stay behind and let their companions return to Earth first. As a result, all the strange events replay once again, but this time, the roles are reversed. The commander occasionally hears noises coming from the escape pod. When he changed the battery, he noticed that the white cloth covering Joe's head was floating up. He tries to secure it back in place, even leaning in to listen carefully. He felt like Joe was still alive because he could vividly hear her voice speaking in his ear. Feeling a sense of panic, the commander immediately reported to the command center, stating that Joe's wound had severe lacerations, and leaving the zero-gravity environment to return to Earth would surely result in massive bleeding. Without waiting for a response from the command center, he moved Joe's body out of the escape pod. He was prepared to leave her forever on the space station. Just before letting go, he deeply apologized, and then he felt Joe firmly grasp his hand. But when he came to his senses, he didn't see anything unusual. Meanwhile, Magnus found Alice hiding in the closet. He thought it was inappropriate for her to hide in the closet in the middle of the night. But Alice's demeanor suddenly changed drastically. She ignored her father's warning and directly closed the closet door. Magnus could only leave helplessly as Alice seemed to see Joe's figure, but when she opened the closet door, there was nothing there, echoing the scene when Joe saw the closet door earlier. It's highly likely that the dual quantum entanglement experiment caused the two worlds to overlap. The next day, while Alice and the commander's daughter were playing in the yard, the commander's wife poked her head out to tell her that her father was coming back. Alice's expression darkened. Her mother was coming back too, even though it was just a cold body. But Magnus brought another piece of bad news. Joe's body might have to stay on the space station forever. Meanwhile, the commander had finished changing the batteries and was ready to return to Earth in the escape pod. However, he encountered the same bolt malfunction, which required 2 people to fix simultaneously. After he pounded on the dashboard, the malfunction miraculously resolved itself. He couldn't believe his eyes as he stared at the space station. It seemed like there was someone standing by the window. Upon safely returning to Earth, he was warmly welcomed by friends and family, but everything felt surreal to the commander. Just a few days ago, his teammate was alive and well, and now she could only exist in the form of a tombstone. As he laid down the flowers, he suddenly saw Joe. But it disappeared in the blink of an eye. He didn't know this was the result of the overlapping of 2 worlds. He thought it was just an illusion. Facing Joe's family, he explained that leaving her on the space station was the only option, and then he began describing Joe's gruesome wound. Magnus noticed Alice's horrified expression and quickly pulled her away. Later, Alice walked into the parking lot with a gloomy expression, throwing her beloved doll on the ground and stomping on it until the commander's daughter came to stop her. But Alice was ungrateful and even gouged out the doll's eyes. The commander was deeply troubled by the frequent appearance of bizarre illusions. What's more surprising was that during the investigation meeting, when he mentioned the dual quantum entanglement experiment, everyone present, including his astronaut teammates, claimed that the space station had never conducted such an experiment, a fact corroborated by the surveillance videos from that time. The investigating committee then pointed out that the commander's decision to leave Joe's body on the space station without authorization from the command center was incomprehensible. While searching online for information about past astronaut launches, the commander was shocked to see a video of a rocket launch failure many years ago, where only one astronaut, named Henry, survived. The commander was astonished because he distinctly remembered that the launch was successful, despite mid-flight malfunctions that resulted in the deaths of 2 astronauts. Henry had bravely intervened and ensured the successful launch of the rocket. The commander rushed to the command center to meet Henry in person, as Henry was the initiator of the dual quantum entanglement experiment. However, the person in charge incredulously shook her head, stating that Henry had been in a decline since that mission and had retired long ago. It couldn't have been him who initiated the experiment. The commander was even more shocked because he distinctly remembered having a conversation with Henry before the space station accident. Despite their arguments, they couldn't reach any conclusion because they didn't know that the commander's symptoms were similar to Joe's. His body was in one world, but his memories belonged to another. This could be the result of the 2 worlds overlapping when the experimental device was activated. Realizing something was amiss, the commander began to reassess his life. He noticed that his way of addressing his wife and daughter seemed to make them uncomfortable, and even some small habits were intolerable to his present self. He couldn't shake the feeling that something unimaginable had happened on the space station. Similarly, Alice felt lost and enraged. She shredded the gift celebrating her mother's return, only to suddenly hear piano sound, even though there was no piano in the house. Magnus, observing the mess around him, felt that Joe's death had deeply affected Alice. He then sought help from a psychologist, who suggested holding a funeral for Joe, as the ritual could help the child cope with her grief. Magnus quickly arranged everything at home for the funeral, but Alice refused to come out of the closet. She insisted that Joe was still in space, and she couldn't bear to say goodbye to thin air. Helpless, Magnus had no choice but to go downstairs to attend to the guests. Meanwhile, the commander lingered at the door, unable to bring himself to enter. He felt it was his selfishness that had left Joe's body in space, and, more importantly, he believed Joe hadn't died at that moment. His wife's gaze was filled with pity, urging him to join them inside. Seeing her father's distracted demeanor, the daughter took matters into her own hands and brought Alice directly to him. Just as she finished speaking, Alice turned her head to see another version of herself. The commander was so shocked that he collapsed to the ground, while Alice couldn't help but scream at the sight of Joe's appearance. Afterwards, Magnus suggested taking Alice somewhere for a vacation to relax. Without hesitation, Alice expressed her desire to go to the cabin in the woods where Joe often went. On the other hand, the commander's wife woke up to find her husband missing. She then went to the person in charge at the command center to inquire about his whereabouts. The person in charge expressed heavily that many astronauts developed post-traumatic stress disorder after returning from space, often seeing all sorts of inexplicable entities. She advised the commander's wife to prepare herself psychologically because even if they found the commander, the command center would still suspend him from duty. Meanwhile, the commander unexpectedly arrived at Henry's residence. In this world, Henry seemed much more awkward, living in an unknown apartment. What surprised the commander even more was that Henry didn't recognize him. In the commander's memory, Henry was his mentor at the command center, and he recounted how Henry's efforts ensured the successful launch of the rocket. Henry's expression gradually turned cold as he realized that the commander was referring to another version of Henry from another world. Seeing the commander's probing demeanor, Henry took out a gun from the drawer. As Magnus and Alice continued their journey towards the cabin in the woods, they encountered a fork in the road. Magnus noticed that the path ahead was blocked by ice, suggesting they should head to the town and find a hotel to stay for the night. However, Alice remained adamant about reaching the cabin tonight, feeling a strong pull towards it. She was even willing to walk there if necessary. Reluctantly, Magnus agreed to accompany Alice, and they hurried towards the cabin. Upon arriving, they found the interior exactly as they remembered it, with the same decorations and paintings. Alice became lost in thought as she gazed at a mural on the wall, one of Joe's favorite artworks. Overwhelmed by emotions, Magnus couldn't hold back his tears, prompting Alice to comfort him, expressing her belief that Joe would surely reappear. In the night, Alice suddenly noticed a light outside the cabin. She approached the window and saw Joe slowly approaching.